morning. Thank you for inviting me to Tallinn. It's a beautiful city, and I've enjoyed my stay. So I'd like to talk to you today about something called crisis leadership. And in order to talk about crisis leadership, we have to first talk about a crisis. It's hard to define what a crisis is, but I can assure you, when you're in one, you will know it. But one thing about crises is that they come unexpectedly when you least know it. What I'd like to do during this talk is have you experience what I experienced through me and feel some of what I felt and feel some of what the other hundreds of responders to 9/11 felt that awful morning. So let's set the date. It's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. It's about 8:30 in the morning or so, and I'm sleeping because I had worked in the emergency department the night before and got in very, very late, actually very early at about 3 o'clock in the morning. My phone went off near the bed and I answered it. And it was a colleague saying, "Did you see what happened?" "No. An airplane just flew into the World Trade Center." And I said, "Really? Okay." Short conversation and we hung up. And I thought that either I was still sleeping or some fool couldn't miss the tallest building in the world with his airplane. What is this all about? So I put my robe on and went down to the television as my family was watching the television and witnessed what the world was witnessing at that time, and that was one of the towers burning. And I actually arrived just about the time the second plane hit. So now I was watching, like the rest of the world was watching, the two towers burning and realized, like everyone else realized, this was no accident. One thing that I was watching for, though, was what my potential role in this might be, because I was wearing a different hat at that time as well. At that time, I was the commander of a Level 1 federal disaster medical team, part of the National Disaster Medical System in the United States of America, one of about 20 teams in the country at that time. And a Level 1 means that in the event of a federal disaster, we are the first out the door. And in fact, not too earlier before this, we had started a system where of the different teams, there would be one team on high alert for each of the three sections of America, the East Coast, the West Coast, and the central part. And it just so happens that my team, designated Massachusetts 2, was on high alert for the eastern coast of America that month. So I was watching, and as I was watching, I was saying to myself, I don't see any possible way that we would have to set up our team, which essentially is a disaster field medical team, in Lower Manhattan in New York City. How would that be possible? We usually go to hurricanes, other devastating events where the areas are just decimated, no infrastructure left, and we do our work. This is Manhattan. And then it was a little after 10 a.m., and the first building fell. And I felt that cold feeling down my spine that probably everybody felt as we saw that immense destruction. And a little voice in my head said, "We're going." And minutes later, my pager went off, a number from Washington, D.C., and I called. And it was a very short telephone call. It said, "Dr. Ciottone, Massachusetts 2 is activated. Get your team and your cache of supplies to Stewart Air Force Base, just north of New York City, as quickly as possible, any way you can. Click." Now, this is very different. We weren't usually activated that way. Usually it was, we will meet your team and your supplies at a certain place at a certain time, and we will transport you to whatever disaster we're going to, either by ground, by air, typically some military transport. This was different, so we had to get ourselves there any way we could. So luckily, in the event of such a crisis, I had a credit card, a federal credit card that became activated. So we rented buses, we rented trucks, and we got ourselves to New York City. And this that I'm showing you now, or will show you, is the actual activation order that came through on fax soon after I had the phone call. And if you read this, it should send chills down your spine as well. So imagine going from sleeping to this in a matter of minutes. And when you do something like this, when you respond like this, or when you're a leader in a crisis like this, there's a few things that you have to do. We call it compartmentalizing. We call it putting things in a package and putting that package away. Either the military sometimes calls that squaring things away, locking things down. These are personal issues, personal things. So what were my personal issues that day? It was my oldest son's first day of school. later that day. I was going to miss it. It was my brother's wedding 3 days later. I was the best man. I was going to miss it. My wife had to deal with all of these family issues while I ran out the door and ran towards New York City. Very, very difficult things. But we had to compartmentalize that. We had to put that in a box, and we had to put that away. All of us did. Everybody had personal issues. So we did. We made our way down to New York City. We got to Stewart Air Force Base that evening. The team went to sleep, because sleep is important, especially when you think you're going to be on a long deployment, which we very well knew we were going to be. And I went into meetings with the federal and the local officials. And to give you an example of how confusing it was at that time, we really didn't know what was going on. We were trying to figure out how we're going to get in, what we're going to do, and what we're going to find. And there were really two orders that came out of that night. One was we were going to move into ground zero that next morning, first thing in the morning on the 12th. The other is that we ordered 50,000 body bags be delivered by the U.S. military to ground zero. Because at that time, we thought we were going to walk into a scene with 50,000 dead. In fact, we thought there might be more. Because at any given time in those towers, there were 25,000 people working from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. But then, what about the visitors, others traveling through? Could there be more? We weren't sure. So what we saw when we walked into ground zero was complete devastation. What was our task? Our task was to set up medical stations, which we did, and you can see some of them lined up here. But what we saw was complete devastation. And I can say very clearly, though it is a cliche, that I and my team were stopped dead in our tracks the minute we saw this. It was the most horrifying sight I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a lot of disasters and a lot of things. For as far as you could see, there were undulating piles of destruction going 10 stories up, 2 stories down, everything on fire, everything smoking. It was horrible. It was like a scene out of a horror movie. So you have to gather yourself in this situation. My first feeling, 2 things. Fear. This is very dangerous, this place. And we found out it was very dangerous. We knew it was very dangerous. This was a fire engine that brought some of the first responders in who never returned. This fire engine was 2 blocks away, 2 New York City blocks away from ground zero, yet was still destroyed like this. That was the kind of force and impact. There were signs of humanity everywhere. Everywhere you could see. Clothes, paperwork, rapidly or quickly left rooms like this in adjacent buildings. It was horrible. So fear was one thing. The other was a sense of weakness, of a complete inability to affect any kind of positive change in this situation. How could we ever fix this? You feel like you're feeble. But then you have to resort back to your training, think back and say, you know what? It's not my job and it's not my team's job to fix this. We're a little piece of a big machine without which that machine won't work properly, but that's our job, is to make that machine work. That machine is going to fix this. And that's the way you have to think about things when you get into a situation like that. The other thing we saw immediately was how dangerous ground zero was. Ground zero was a tremendously dangerous scene. Buildings like this, which are large, large buildings, came down days later, and it was devastating. Pieces of the tower were stuck in other buildings nearby, just dangling, waiting to drop, and perhaps fall on somebody if they're underneath. Extremely dangerous scene. So what did we do? We set about what we were there to do, and that was to set up medical stations. So we used every opportunity. Sometimes we would put it inside of a building. So in fact, this is a medical station we put inside of one of the lining buildings that was still standing in a deli. And as you can see, we made use of every space, every piece, every area that we could. But there was one problem with these, and that was one of the medical stations that we put in another building, the American Express building. How safe were these buildings? Well, they were deemed safe at the time. We thought they were safe, so we moved in. And I remember distinctly a day into this in the American Express building, suddenly the blast to evacuate went off. We all went running out of the building. They thought it was coming down. This is a building that would be one of the largest buildings in any other city in the world other than New York City. Very large building. So we waited outside. And about an hour later, an engineer approached and said, okay, Dr. Ciottone, the building's okay. You can go back in with your team. I said, really? Okay, you go first. I'll follow you. And other tents we set up were like this, traditional tents that we carry with us. But there's some issues with that as well. So when I went to set this tent up, this tent was on the good side of a building, all in ground zero, but not where the towers were, and it was just on the lip of the building. So this side of the building was pretty damaged. It's where the towers fell. This side looked pretty good. And the first thing we think about is scene safety. So I put the tent there, said, I think this is going to be okay. In putting it there, I talked to a fire chief and I said, we need to clear this area out. All this debris has to go, and that fire engine has to go. There was a fire engine there. It looked like it just pulled up, untouched. Fire chief said, yeah, we can clear all this out, but that fire engine has to stay. That was one of the first in, and they were all killed. And then I realized, and I looked, and it was shocking because it didn't look like the other fire engines because it was protected. And for a moment, I could see in this fire chief's eyes that he had lost a lot of good friends there. And for a moment, with a complete stranger, we shared a moment of sorrow. And the fire engine stayed as a memorial, and we continued our work. But one problem with this tent, we put it in the wrong place, because several days later, a piece of that building fell, went flying through this tent, almost killed somebody. And my feeling inside of me suddenly, as a crisis leader, as the leader who made the order to put that tent there, was, oh my gosh, I just made a mistake that might have killed somebody. What do you do with that? Because you got more leading to do. Well, you box that up and you put that away, and you trust in yourself and your instincts and your abilities, and you just go forward. Ground Zero, as I said, was an extremely, extremely unsafe place. And in order to be safe there, you have to be accountable and be intelligent in what you do and follow orders. Every hour, everybody was to check in by radio with the central command. If you didn't check in, we checked in with you, and we found you. But one issue with this is, I had a couple team members who had some problems because of the enormity of the event. Very seasoned disaster responders, but this was a different thing. A terrorist attack is a different thing. You feel vulnerable. What if there's a second attack? What's happening to my family at home? Very confusing time. And they were becoming a little unsafe, one in particular. You can't be unsafe in Ground Zero. You could die. So what I did was quickly made him my personal assistant. And I said, forget what you're doing. Come and stand next to me, and don't leave my side, so I can keep an eye on you, essentially, until we made arrangements to send him home. These are some decisions you have to make on the fly, quickly, to keep your team safe, because your number one priority is to keep your team safe. So what did we do at Ground Zero? We set up 5 medical tents. We were seeing 400 patients per day for the first 2 weeks. Not many people know that. We didn't see any victims that came out of the disaster, however. These were all responders, working beyond their endurance to get their comrades out of this pile alive if they could. It was very, very difficult emotionally to realize that after a couple days, nobody is coming out of this pile. We knew that. And the other thing about Ground Zero is, when you walk in, the first thing you say is, where is all the concrete? What happened to the concrete? And then you realize the impact was so tremendous, it essentially made the concrete into dust. And then it's a quick step from there to realize, where are all the people? 3,000 people are dead. Where are they? We see some, we got some bodies, but where are the rest? And then it's an easy step again to say, this dust is maybe not all concrete. And something happened to me. I thought it was unique to me, but it turned out it was actually common to many people, including many on my team. When I got home, I could never clean the dust off my boots. They're still sitting in a corner with the dust on them. Because in a way, this was a sacred place. In a way, that dust was human remains, perhaps. And that takes a toll as well. It takes an emotional toll. Ground Zero is not something we will ever forget as a country. It's not something that I will ever forget as a responder. I can honestly say, I said it then, I'll say it now, and I hope I say in the future, leading a team to Ground Zero was the greatest thing that I've ever done. The greatest thing or honor that was ever bestowed upon me. And I will take it to my grave. I'll remember it forever. When I talk to my grandchildren, hopefully when I'm in my 80s or 90s, I'll be telling them about my experience at Ground Zero. It was a tremendously difficult thing. It was not like any other disaster. It was emotionally and physically draining, and you see and hear evidence of that. But it's not anything that any of us will ever forget. As we went for the 2 weeks of search and rescue, we were seeing 400 patients per day, a testament to how hard people were working. The moment it went from search and rescue to search and recovery, which was the day that we went home, but other teams came in, that number dropped to 120-something per day, which tells me that while there was a chance, while there were people still alive, these firefighters, these police, these EMS, some of us were in that pile working as hard as we could to try to get them out, getting injured, inhalational problems, other things. And then when we realized it's no longer possible that somebody will come out alive, everybody eased up a little bit, and they took care of themselves a little bit more and addressed the pile in a little bit different way. So people ask me now, what do I think most about this experience? Well, I can tell you one thing. It was probably the most, again, emotionally moving event I've ever had in my life. I couldn't really experience it then. I had to push that, square that away so I could be a leader for my team and appear as a strong leader for my team. But all of us are being affected by it. And how was I affected? For the first 3 months after I got home, every time I passed a construction site, because essentially Ground Zero is like one big construction site, I would break into a cold sweat. When I went to the Haiti earthquake and I saw Port-au-Prince at night, and I saw the same kind of destruction from that earthquake in the city, and I smelled the same kind of smells, and saw the same kind of smoke, it struck me for a moment and brought me back to Ground Zero. And I can tell you that after leaving Ground Zero, 2 weeks after 9/11, I was not able to ever go back. And I would not have ever gone back unless I wasn't asked to just come and be a part of this large celebration, nothing important, but a part of the large celebration, the 10th anniversary of the event. And I did go back then. It was the first time I was able to. And it was a very, very, as you can imagine, very, very moving thing. As I saw some of the things in the museum that we'd actually walked through and seen, like the fire engine and other things. So again, people ask me, what do I take most from Ground Zero? Well, there's really two major things I take from Ground Zero. First is a tremendous amount of pride in my team and how they acted in a physically demanding event, emotionally demanding event, how they superbly accomplished the task at hand. And then the other thing that I think about is, on a personal note, what I'm most personally proud of is that I brought 54 people into Ground Zero, into that tragedy on 9/11, and 2 weeks later I brought 54 people out. And I'm very, very proud of that. And I feel that that is, again, one of my greatest accomplishments. And I hope just by this brief talk that you had a moment to feel what it might feel like to go from sleeping in your bed at home expecting to take your child to school for the first time, 2 hours later being immersed in this horrible crisis. It's a moving thing, and it's a thing that will stay with you forever. So again, thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful time in Tallinn.